Book 1, Part 2 of the Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. The Annals by Publius Cornelius Tacitus, Volume 1, translated by Alfred John Church and William Jackson Brodrib. Book 1, A.D. 14 and 15. Part 2. The throng applauded from various motives, some pointing with indignation to the marks of the lash, others to their gray locks, and most of them to their threadbare garments and naked limbs. At last, in their fury, they went so far as to propose to combine the three legions into one. Driven from their purpose by the jealousy with which everyone sought the chief honor for his own legion, they turned to other thoughts, and set up in one spot the three eagles, with the ensigns of the cohorts. At the same time they piled up turf and raised a mound, that they might have a more conspicuous meeting place. Amid the bustle, Blysus came up. He upbraided them, and held back man after man with the exclamation, "Better imbrue your hands in my blood. It would be less guilt to slay your commander than it is to be in revolt from the emperor. Either, living, I will uphold the loyalty of the legions, or, pierced to the heart, I will hasten on your repentance." None the less, however, was the mound piled up, and it was quite breast high when, at last overcome by his persistency, they gave up their purpose. Blysus, with the consummate tact of an orator, said, "It is not through mutiny and tumult that the desires of the army ought to be communicated to Caesar. Nor did our soldiers of old ever ask so novel a boon of ancient commanders, nor have you yourselves asked it of the divine Augustus. It is far from opportune that the emperor's cares, now in their first beginning, should be aggravated. If, however, you are bent upon attempting in peace what even after your victory in the civil wars you did not demand, why, contrary to the habit of obedience, contrary to the laws of discipline, do you meditate violence? Decide on sending envoys, and give them instructions in your presence." It was carried by acclamation that the son of Blysus, one of the tribunes, should undertake the mission, and demand for the soldiers release from service after 16 years. He was to have the rest of their message when the first part had been successful. After the young man's departure there was comparative quiet, but there was an arrogant tone among the soldiers, to whom the fact that their commander's son was pleading their common cause clearly showed that they had wrested by compulsion what they had failed to obtain by good behavior. Meanwhile the companies which previous to the mutiny had been sent to Nauportus to make roads and bridges and for other purposes, when they heard of the tumult in the camp, tore up the standards, and having plundered the neighbouring villages and Nauportus itself, which was like a town, assailed the centurions, who restrained them with jeers and insults, and last of all with blows. Their chief rage was against Aufidianus Rufus, the camp prefect, whom they dragged from a wagon loaded with baggage, and drove on at the head of the column. Asking him in ridicule whether he liked to bear such huge burdens in such long marches. Rufus, who had long been a common soldier, then a centurion, and subsequently camp prefect, tried to revive the old severe discipline, inured as he was to work and toil, and all the sterner because he had endured. On the arrival of these troops the mutiny broke out afresh, and straggling from the camp they plundered the neighbourhood. Blysus ordered a few who had conspicuously loaded themselves with spoil to be scourged and imprisoned as a terror to the rest, for, even as it then was, the commander was still obeyed by the centurions and by all the best men among the soldiers. As the men were dragged off, they struggled violently, clasped the knees of the bystanders, called to their comrades by name, or to the company, cohort, or legion to whom they respectively belonged, exclaiming that they were all threatened with the same fate. At the same time they heaped abuse on the commander, they appealed to heaven and to the gods, and left nothing undone by which they might excite resentment and pity, alarm and rage. They all rushed to the spot, broke open the guardhouse, unbound the prisoners, and were in a moment fraternizing with deserters and men convicted on capital charges. Thence arose a more furious outbreak, with more leaders of the mutiny. Vubulenus, a common soldier, was hoisted in front of the general's tribunal on the shoulders of the bystanders, and addressed the excited throng, who eagerly awaited his intentions. "You have indeed," he said, "restored light and air to these innocent and most unhappy men; but who restores to my brother his life, or my brother to myself? Sent to you by the German army in our common cause, he was last night butchered by the gladiators, whom the general keeps and arms for the destruction of his soldiers. Answer, Blaesus, where have you flung aside the corpse? Even an enemy grudges not burial. When, with embraces and tears, I have sated my grief, order me also to be slain, provided that only when we have been destroyed for no crime, but only because we have consulted the good of the legions, we may be buried by those men around me." He inflamed their excitement by weeping and smiting his breast and face with his hands. Then, hurling aside those who bore him on their shoulders, and impetuously flinging himself at the feet of one man after another, he roused such dismay and indignation that some of the soldiers put fetters on the gladiators who were among the number of Blaesus's slaves. Others did the like to the rest of his household, while a third party hurried out to look for the corpse. And had it not quickly been known that no corpse was found, that the slaves, when tortures were applied, denied the murder, and that the man never had a brother, they would have been on the point of destroying the general. As it was, they thrust out the tribunes and the camp prefect, they plundered the baggage of the fugitives, and they killed a centurion, Lucilius, to whom, with soldiers' humor, they have given the name "Bring another," because when he had broken one vine stick on a man's back, he would call in a loud voice for another and another. The rest sheltered themselves in concealment, and only one was detained, Clemens Julius, whom the soldiers considered a fit person to carry messages, from his ready wit. 2 legions, the 8th and the 15th, were actually drawing swords against each other, the former demanding the death of a centurion, whom they nicknamed Sulpicius, when the men of the 15th defended him, but the soldiers of the 9th interposed their entreaties, and when these were disregarded, their menaces. This intelligence had such an effect on Tiberius, close as he was, and most careful to hush up every very serious disaster, that he dispatched his son Drusus, with the leading men of the state, and with 2 praetorian cohorts, without any definite instructions, to take suitable measures. The cohorts were strengthened beyond their usual force with some picked troops. There was, in addition, a considerable part of the praetorian cavalry, and the flower of the German soldiery, which was then the emperor's guard. With them, too, was the commander of the praetorians, Aelius Sejanus, who had been associated with his own father, Strabo, had great influence with Tiberius, and was to advise and direct the young prince, and to hold out punishment or reward to the soldiers. When Drusus approached, the legions, as a mark of respect, met him, not as usual with glad looks or the glitter of military decorations, but in unsightly squalor, and faces which, though they simulated grief, rather expressed defiance. As soon as he entered the intrenchments, they secured the gates with sentries, and ordered bodies of armed men to be in readiness at certain points of the camp. The rest crowded round the general's tribunal in a dense mass. Drusus stood there, and with a gesture of his hand demanded silence. As often as they turned their eyes back on the throng, they broke into savage exclamations. Then, looking up to Drusus, they trembled. There was a confused hum, a fierce shouting, and a sudden lull. Urged by conflicting emotions, they felt panic, and they caused the like. At last, in an interval of the uproar, Drusus read his father's letter, in which it was fully stated that he had especial care for the brave legions, with which he had endured a number of campaigns; that, as soon as his mind was recovered from his grief, he would lay their demands before the senators; that meanwhile he had sent his son to concede unhesitatingly what could be immediately granted, and that the rest must be reserved for the senate, which ought to have a voice in showing either favor or severity. The crowd replied that they had delivered their instructions to Clemens, one of the centurions.